Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Santiago Lachiguiri wash processed Mexico from Thankfully Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Thankfully, based out of Auburn, Alabama. And this coffee is our April 2024 Coffee of the Month, as it was voted on by you guys as the coffee you most want to see us review. This is also Thankfully Coffee's second ever appearance on this channel, having previously reviewed the Pepe Hon Toxtator Wash Processed Ecuador last year. And since that review, I wanted to go back and revisit them. And that's why I was kind of surprised and happy that they won our most recent Coffee of the Month poll, because they're not necessarily the most well-known coffee roaster out there. So this is a perfect opportunity to revisit them. And I'm looking forward to discussing this one, as this right here is day 37. And recipe we went with for this coffee was a recipe that Thankfully gave to us at a 15.7 to 1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 95 degrees Celsius, about 203 degrees Fahrenheit. And I liked this one best through the V60, though truth be told, it was very close, as I found it to be pretty even amongst brew methods, but opting for the V60 does indicate a more medium fine grind. Now, roast profile for this coffee. So this one interestingly reminded me a fair bit of some of the Mexican coffees that we've reviewed from Passenger in the past, which is definitely on the lighter side of things relative to a lot of other American coffee roasters. And I feel like that's kind of the best place to put this one, as it may not have necessarily felt quite as light as some of those that we've had in the past from Passenger. And I feel like they do have some lighter profiled coffees that they offer as well. But even then, it does skew on the slightly lighter side of things. So I feel like people could probably put it in the slightly more developed side of that light, or in the more lighter side of that light medium, which I feel like is kind of a better placement for this one. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression, and we opted for the V60, and the cup was about as straightforward as you might expect for a wash processed Mexican coffee, as it offered a robust chocolate and nutty aspect to it. Moderate in terms of the sweetness, with some slight background citric aspects to it. Pretty much everything you would expect from a Mexican coffee, so not too much to take away from this first impression. We move on to day 17, as we opted for the Chemex, and it was a little bit better on this day, as there was much more sweetness and clarity to the cup, offering better definition to the chocolate and nutty aspects as well. But for the most part, this one continued to offer a pretty straightforward experience. We move on to day 20, as we opted for the April Brewer, and the cup was best right off brew, as it offered some nice sweeter and more defined aspects in the cup itself, especially on the more traditional side of things, with the chocolate and nuttiness being present once again as the most notable aspects to it. In addition to that, some subtle lighter fruits in both a berry and citric sense. Cool down was just okay, as it skewed a little bit more on some lighter nut side of things, so not necessarily my favorite, at least in terms of that experience. We move on to day 23, as we opted for the V60 with Thankfully Coffee's recipe, and the cup has been very consistent up to this point, and this was no exception, though it felt best to right off brew with some sweeter classic Mexican profiles to it. It also offered a little bit more sweetness as well, so that made it my favorite experience up to this point, with a nice bit of body and some slight brown sugar sweetness as well. Day 26, opted for the Chemex with Thankfully Coffee's recipe, and this is the best that had been up to this point, and I continued to notice that with the Chemex, and that it offered a little bit more clarity each time we brewed it, especially right after a V60 day, and that was present on this one yet again, with better definition to the sweeter and sugary chocolate aspects of this cup. Some ever so slight candied honey with a graham cracker-like sweetness as well, before it settles into the more subtle nutty qualities within the finish, so this one was better and definitely my favorite experience up to that point. Day 29, back through the V60 with Thankfully Coffee's recipe, and once again, I continued to notice just great consistency with the V60 in general, as there was improvement with the cup being the best it's been up to this point in terms of a very nice level of chocolate and sugary sweetness, some slight citrus zest, as well as just a general straightforward experience with this one yet again. Day 32 through the Chemex with Thankfully Coffee's recipe, and I continue to say that it's a very close call in terms of which brew method I preferred, because these coffees were just so similar, and I feel like the V60 continued to offer just better consistency, while the Chemex offered a slight bit more clarity and definition to the rest of this coffee. Emphasis continued to remain on the more traditional Mexican characteristics, though it was, I would still say, on the sweeter side of what I might typically experience from a washed Mexican coffee. Chocolate remains at the forefront, but once again, pretty consistent as this brew method as well. Day 35, final notes we have, opted for the V60 with this final cup, and it continues to offer very nice consistency with some candied chocolate aspects, complemented by some sugary components as well. A little bit of citric brightness. The nuttiness has since settled a little bit over time, so not quite as pronounced, especially within the finish. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have quite a few level 4s, so let's go through those, and we will start with the cleanliness level 4. This was almost always going to be the case with this coffee, given that the definition and profile to it is about as straightforward as you might expect. There isn't anything to hinder that level 4 in terms of the overall cleanliness, so that's about exactly where you'd expect to place that for this coffee. Finish, level 4. And the finish in this coffee does continue to skew a little bit more, I would say, actually on the sugary side of things. Relative to some of the earlier days, which might have gone a little bit more in the nutty direction, I feel like with some adjustments and overall with time on this coffee, I'm noticing a little bit more of that. In addition to it though, there is a slight kind of lingering citric quality to it as well, which gives this cup a little bit more depth than just that straightforward traditional Mexican coffee. That's something we will touch on shortly here as well. Sweetness, level 4. I'd already mentioned that this one does offer a bit of a sweeter profile relative to just the average wash processed Mexican coffee, as I noticed that right from the, I would say, third, fourth cup, and from that point going forward, I continued to really appreciate a lot of the more sugary aspects of the chocolate-like component within this one, and that's why that's justified itself at that level 4 mark. And then chocolate level 4, about as straightforward as possible, with this one just offering a very chocolate forward cup. Most dominant, pronounced, and consistent note in this one for the entirety of this coffee. We move on to level 3s, and I feel like this is where things actually get pretty interesting, and we'll start with the acidity level 3. This one had a little bit more brightness than I might have expected for a Mexican coffee, though I have to say that it didn't reach the same levels as a lot of, we'll just say, Kenyan coffees in general, though for a Mexican coffee, this one is also skewing on the higher side of things relative to the brightness, acidity you might expect for it. Florality level 2, I know it's at level 2, and I wanted to discuss that one real quick because I feel like there was enough of a vanilla-like aspect to it in a slightly more floral sense, as well as that honey-like component, that as I'm looking at this tasting wheel now, I'm like, I could have probably justified a level 3, and that's why I wanted to go back and kind of discuss that briefly as well. Spice, level 3, and on the other side of things, I feel like that might be slightly high, though I would say that there's a little bit more of some like spiced qualities, like a little bit of nutmeg to go along with that listed s'mores note that they have on here. So I could see maybe a little bit more of a sweeter spiced aspect to this one as well, pushing that all the way up there at that level 3 mark. Citrus fruit, level 3, and I mentioned the brightness, and it is coming a little bit more in terms of a citric zest quality to it, as that's the best way I can describe this. Every time I was drinking this coffee, I'm like, okay, it's very Mexican profiled, and then after that, I'm like, okay, it's actually offering a very kind of interesting zesty quality to it as well that goes counter to the rest of this coffee. And I feel like that was something that was definitely worth noting, especially towards the end, as those things were present within this coffee. And when I went and I looked back at the actual descriptors that they had of this coffee, they listed something along those lines as well. And I said, okay, that makes sense. And it explains why I had a lot of those notes on this coffee throughout as well. Caramel, level 3. Interestingly, not something I discussed too much, and I feel like that's a little bit more attributed to the like graham cracker-like aspect of this one, because honestly, it didn't really have as much of a caramelized aspect or a straightforward caramel component as I might have expected for a Mexican coffee. So that's a little bit more reminiscent of some of the other sugary qualities that's present within this. Savoriness, level 3, that's the nuttiness. Even then, I would say that towards the end of this coffee, it wasn't quite to the same extent as some of the earlier days. And as I'm drinking this coffee now, I'm like, level 3 also feels maybe slightly generous, so lower side of level 3. And then final thing worth discussing is the body at the level 3. And on some of the earlier days, I said I can maybe see this scoring higher side of level 3, lower side of level 4. As I'm drinking this coffee on this day, and as I made the tasting wheel, though, I said it's a little closer to a medium-bodied cup of coffee. Even then, it's still offering a fair bit of texture to go with the rest of the cup. So as I'm looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it's a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. I feel like it's somewhat safe to say that when it comes to coffees in this vein, there is a little bit of a ceiling to just how good they can be. And I've kind of said that in the past with a lot of the other wash processed Mexican coffees that we've had in the past, though I feel like a lot of people might agree with me on this. Mexican coffee over the last 10 years has just dramatically improved, as I do recall having so many Mexican coffees at a younger age that didn't quite live up to just how good this coffee was. So I've definitely seen a lot of improvement with these coffees over time. And this one right here, I feel like there was always kind of a little bit of a ceiling that this coffee could offer, and that's why I want to compliment the coffee roaster on this one as well as the producer, because I feel like this is about as good or the best I think I could have experienced from a coffee like this. It's not something that I would say just really impressed me to a significant level, mostly because I don't think that this coffee is really capable of achieving that. Though the certain aspects, specifically the clarity, the sweetness, and the definition to this one is a testament to, once again, the producer and the roaster for offering something that is very nice, very consistent cup of coffee, and very much a crowd-pleasing sort of coffee, which does transition into the type of person I would suggest this coffee to. This is very much a crowd pleaser on the lighter side of things, as it does offer all of the expected crowd pleaser-like qualities. Fair bit of body, great clarity, nice sweetness, more traditional characteristics, the chocolatey aspects, the nutty aspects, while still offering a little bit more of a a little bit more of a modern feel to it, with that slight contrasting brightness that gives it a little bit more depth. But once again, as far as Mexican coffee goes, I think that this is kind of the best way I can leave this one and the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Santiago Lachiguiri wash processed Mexico from Thankfully Coffee. Thank you for watching.